So I'm currently working with CDFW, but I want to highlight some of the research that I did with my PhD advisor, Stephanie Carlson, who has the unfortunate task of having to teach a class on a tropical paradise in French Polynesia, so she's unable to be here today. So we've heard about intermittent streams, and I just want to go over some of the challenges that have already been discussed. So biota living in intermittent streams have to deal with seasonal contraction and expansion. As we heard Cleo mention, changes in water quantity and quality. And as you can imagine, as riffles start to dry up, it also minimizes the movement of stream organisms. And when pools start to shrink, also you have intensified community dynamics as fish become more concentrated in pools, and there's more intense predation and competition going on. And indeed, some papers have found that some of these challenges can result in extreme mortality of stream biota. So some past papers have documented this. And in some extreme cases, there have been instances of local extirpation of red shiner and some macroinvertebrates in stream communities. However, as Chad mentioned in the morning session, there's also some benefits for stream biota living in intermittent streams. They provide refuges, and they can also be important spawning grounds for fish. They can also be important rearing habitats, as they use intermittent streams for refuge from predators or from high flow events. And recently, we've also documented that there can be really high aquatic biodiversity in intermittent streams also. So I was really interested in understanding what drove this dichotomy. Why in some cases there are some findings are saying that there's high mortality or conditions can be really harsh, whereas in other cases people have found that intermittent streams can be beneficial. So what I wanted to look at was interannual differences in precipitation primarily. So what we can see is this is some hydrographs from my study region. We can see that 2009 and 2012 were relatively dry years, whereas 2010 and 2011 were relatively wet years. So I wanted to see how differences in antecedent precipitation drove survival of the stream fishes. So my study organisms, I focused on steelhead trout, and I focused on the juvenile life stage during the summer rearing period. And the populations that I focused on were in the Central California coast distinct population segment. And my study site was the John West Fork, which is in the Golden Gate National Recreation Area in Marin County. It's a small coastal watershed that's part of the Lagunitas watershed. And it's unregulated, and it's a naturally intermittent stream. The only two fish species that are found within the study area are steelhead trout and coho salmon. And because coho salmon didn't make it up every year, I focused my study on steelhead. So I showed these before. I just wanted to again point out that there was really big differences in annual rainfall. And so again, I'm going to call 2009 and 2012 dry years and 2010 and 2011 wet years. And I also have at the top this hydrograph if you guys want to just follow along as a reminder for which years are wet and which years are dry. So in 2009, I focused on 12 study pools, and in 2010, I expanded my study area to include 30 pools, including the original 12 that I studied in 2009. And the questions that I asked were, what are the patterns of fragmentation within and among years? And also, how does the contraction in pool habitat differ among years? And what are the consequences of contraction for juvenile steelhead survival? So to begin with my first objective, I basically did some really simple wet-dry mapping. I went out to each of my habitat units and noted if it was wet or dry. And so some of the results from this that I want to point out are that during my 2 dry years, so I just want to go over these. The blue indicates that there's flow present. The yellow indicates that there are isolated pools present, and the red indicates sections of the creek that have gone completely dry. And so if you look at the wet years and compare them to the dry years, you'll notice that it tends to be wetter in the wet years as we move across time. So for example, in September, we already see that sections have gone completely dry in the dry years, whereas in September of the wet years, we see that there are still isolated pools that are still present. And one other thing that I wanted to point out was that regardless of whether it was a wet or dry year, there was a section of creek that pretty regularly went dry every year, and that was influenced heavily by the geomorphology of that section. So next I wanted to look at how the contraction in pool habitat differed among years. And I did that by using a total station to map the stream bed and the water surface. And I estimated volumes using ArcMap. And I also anchored meter sticks into my study pools, and I estimated stage every week. And that allowed me to track changes in the volume. For the statistical analyses, I used mixed effects log linear model to look at pool volume as a function of time. And I wanted to compare pairwise intercepts which represent the initial water volume, so the volume at the beginning of the summer, and also the slopes, which represent the rate of drying. And I used a Bayesian approach and to look at pairwise differences between my study years. I compared the posterior differences for the 2 years being examined. So for the results, what we found is that there were no differences in initial water volume here. So, we see that initial water volumes are similar among years. But if we look at the rate of drying, we find that during the dry years, during the driest year, the stream dried at a faster rate when compared to the 2 wettest years. However, there were no other differences that were observed between any 2 years. So next I wanted to look at what the consequences of habitat fragmentation were on juvenile steelhead survival. And to do this, I use a mark recapture study using 3-pass electrofish depletion. And I sampled each pool and I implanted fish that were larger than 60 millimeters with pit tags, which provide them with a unique ID so I could track their fates. And I tracked them using a portable pit antenna once per week, and I used the information to look at their survival. Specifically using program mark, I used a model selection approach, looking at corrected AIC to determine the best models. And so I'm just going to go over some candidate models that I have. So this model is a within-year model looking at survival within a year, and it basically states that survival is constant within a year, so it doesn't change within a year. We also have a fully time-dependent model, meaning that survival differs for each week. And I just want to point out that apparent survival is an estimate of week-to-week survival. So this first point is the survival from the initial capture event to the first resighting, whereas this second point is the survival from the first resighting event to the second resighting event. So you can see that in some cases you have higher survival in later weeks when compared to the earlier weeks. And there was also a resistance model that we wanted to test. So recently, Kate Boersma and colleagues found that there was a resistance effect occurring for stream macroinvertebrates, in which they found that stream macroinvertebrates were able to survive in low flow conditions, but when flow was reduced dramatically, then survival decreased also dramatically. So to look at this, this is kind of a conceptual diagram showing how survival is relatively high up until a critical cold water level is reached when when the water level drops, and then the survival drops off. We also looked at among-year differences, so we combined within and among-year differences. So for this first example, survival within a year is constant, but among years, survival differs. We also wanted to look at a precipitation regime. So in this example, survival is similar between the 2 wet years, and it's similar for the 2 dry years. Based on our model selection results, we found that there was an effective precipitation regime. For the wet years, we found that the fully time-dependent model was best, and the resistance pattern was best in the dry years. So just to show you, you see that survival is relatively high, and it differs among years for the wet years, or among weeks. Whereas for the wet years, we see this trend where it's pretty high early in the summer, and it drops off later in the summer. And so what does that mean for overall survival? If we look at the wet years, it starts out lower, but at the end of the summer, relative to the first week, survival is actually pretty high at 44%. Whereas if we look at the dry years, only about 20% of the fish survived at the end of the summer. So I also want to point out that my study period, the last year of my study was in 2012, so just at the beginning of the drought. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to collect any additional data. I needed to wrap up my PhD, so I ended my study in 2012, but I imagine that survival rates were pretty low in subsequent years also. And I also want to point out that with climate change, there's predicted to be much reduced stream flow. So what that means is that there could be more perennial streams that go intermittent, and also intermittent streams will intensify in the severity of drying that already occurs. So just some take-home points. Fragmentation occurred earlier during the dry years, and entire sections of the creek varied in their propensity to go dry. So some sections of the creek went dry no matter what type of year it was, if it was wet or dry. And pool drying was closely linked to antecedent rainfall. So during the dry years, pools dried typically at a faster rate. And as Cleo mentioned, steelhead were highly resistant to drought, so they were adapted to drought. But when water levels dropped too much, then survival dropped off considerably. And with that, I'd want to thank my collaborators, and I don't know if there are time for questions.